The room was warm that evening, though a shiver clung to me no matter how many times I smoothed the fabric of my dress. I remember thinking that I looked exactly like the woman he had always wanted me to be, composed, elegant, almost ornamental. A wife polished to be shown off. What he didn't realize was that the smile I wore wasn't born of devotion anymore. It was the calm before a storm I had been waiting 5 years to release. My name is Marissa. I'm 32 years old and I've spent most of my adult life being underestimated. To Brian, my husband, until this very night, I was just a simple woman with a literature degree better suited for bedtime stories and book clubs than real conversations about business or money. He called me sweet, supportive, and a perfect partner in public, but behind those words was always something sharp, like I was a harmless doll who existed to make his empire appear respectable. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that it didn't hurt. I told myself it was just his way, that I was overthinking it, that maybe I should be grateful for the life we had. But small cuts over time bleed you dry. It started with his tone, the way he'd explain his work to me as if speaking to a child, the way he'd pat my hand when I asked questions saying, "You wouldn't understand Marissa." Then came the jokes at dinners, little digs wrapped in laughter. I noticed the looks people gave me, pity mixed with dismissal, and it sank into my skin until I almost believed him. Almost. What saved me were the stories I'd grown up loving. The books that had taught me about foreshadowing, about patterns, about the way small details revealed who someone really was. If literature gave me anything, it was the ability to pay attention. And Brian, in his arrogance, never noticed how much I was watching. When he thought I was too naive to understand, he stopped hiding. Documents were left open on the counter, phone calls made in front of me while I folded laundry. "Don't worry about her," he'd tell his partners. "She's too busy thinking about her book club." Each time he said it, something inside me hardened. I began keeping notes. At first, it was just for myself, proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't as oblivious as he believed. A hidden email account, screenshots, photos, transcripts of things he said when he assumed I wasn't listening. But over time, it became more than that. It became evidence. The night that changed everything was so ordinary, it almost makes me laugh now. Rain tapped against the kitchen windows while Brian showered upstairs. I was wiping the counter when his laptop pinged the screen, lighting up with a message. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait until she's gone again." My hand froze. I clicked before I could stop myself, and there it was, months of messages, each one worse than the last. And the name, Vanessa, my husband's lover, my sister's best friend, the woman who hugged me at family gatherings while her hands had already been on my husband hours before. I don't think I cried that night. My chest burned, my stomach twisted, but the tears didn't come. Instead, I took screenshots. I added them to the growing folder of truths he thought I'd never see. When he walked back into the kitchen, hair-damp towel slung around his shoulders, I smiled like nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had. That was when I knew I wasn't just collecting evidence for pride anymore. I was gathering ammunition. I sought out Andrea, an old acquaintance from college, now a lawyer. We met for coffee under the pretense of catching up, but I slipped questions into our conversations about prenups, about recording laws, about what counted in court. She humored me, but she knew. When I finally showed her one of Brian's altered financial documents, her expression changed. "Marissa," she said softly, "this isn't just about divorce, this is criminal." And so I learned. About shell companies and tax evasion, about how my husband had even altered our prenup after I signed it. My signature, his betrayal. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not only was he unfaithful, he had ensured I'd be left with nothing when he inevitably discarded me. He underestimated me so deeply, he believed he could rewrite my future without me ever noticing. For months, I played my role perfectly. The supportive wife, the quiet listener, the woman in the background. Meanwhile, I backed up files, hid recording devices, and built a case with the patience of someone who had been dismissed for too long. And then came the invitation, our 5th anniversary dinner. 40 guests, a private dining room, gold-lettered invitations celebrating 5 years of partnership and success. I ran my fingers over those words again and again, knowing the irony. 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of betrayal. 5 years of planning. That dinner would be the night I stopped pretending. The night of the anniversary came with a strange calm, as if the storm inside me had finally found its direction. My hands didn't tremble when I zipped up my navy dress, the one Brian once called suitable for a faculty wife. He meant it as a backhanded compliment, of course, but that night it felt like armor. I slipped Andrea's card into my clutch alongside a small thumb drive containing everything I had collected over 5 years. Evidence of infidelity, fraud, deceit, proof that the man I had built my life around was nothing but a hollow shell propped up by lies. Brian had left early, promising to meet me at Harlow's, the upscale restaurant downtown. I've arranged everything he said with a perfunctory kiss to my forehead. Just show up looking pretty. It was the last command I ever intended to obey. The Magnolia Room gleamed when I arrived 30 minutes early. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the horseshoe-shaped table, adorned with white roses and silver accents. I walked the perimeter slowly, noting the seating arrangements. His business partners clustered close to him, my family tucked at the edges like ornaments added out of obligation. I slipped a manila folder into the drawer beside my seat, my heart steady. Andrea would arrive at 9. The text messages I'd prepared would go out with one press of a button. Every piece of the trap was in place. The guests arrived in waves. His parents first, his mother smiling that well-rehearsed smile of someone who had never quite approved of me, but tolerated my existence. My sister Claire followed with her husband, squeezing my hand, her eyes searching mine. She didn't know the details, but she sensed something brewing. Then Brian entered, charming, handsome, confident. He had 3 associates flanking him, all laughing loudly at a joke I wasn't meant to understand. His gaze found mine, that indulgent smile spreading across his face. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, kissing my cheek. His hand lingered at my waist like ownership, not affection. Always punctual, always perfect. Dinner unfolded like a performance. Plates changed, glasses refilled, conversations danced around me. I smiled, nodded, asked the right polite questions about vacations and children. All the while I watched Brian grow more animated with each glass of wine, his voice filling the room with boastful stories, his hand occasionally patting my thigh beneath the table, as if to remind me of my role. He didn't know that his role was already written, his final act only minutes away. Between courses, his partner Daniel rose and tapped a glass. A toast to the happy couple. Brian stood, glass in hand, and the room quieted. That smile again, the one he wore when he thought himself clever. 5 years ago, he began, I made what my friends called the safest bet of my career. Marriage to the quiet literature professor who was more interested in fictional worlds than the real one around her. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the room. I held my smile, but my chest tightened. He went on, gesturing grandly, feeding on the silence. I saw what others didn't, a woman who would never question my business decisions, who would stay in her lane while I provided the life she enjoyed. His voice dropped sharp with mockery. So here's to 5 years wasted on a gold-digging nobody. Who knew that my simple wife would be my greatest asset? The chuckles this time were forced, uncomfortable. My sister's face burned with anger. Even his mother looked embarrassed. Brian sat pleased with himself, sipping champagne. That was when I reached for the folder. I stood, voice steady. I'd like to respond to that lovely toast. He smirked, not yet understanding. Of course, honey. Maybe save your gift for later. Oh, but it can't wait. I slid the folder across the table. It's funny you mentioned assets. Because this fake prenup you altered after I signed it, it means you actually get nothing. His face drained of color as he opened it, scanning the side-by-side documents, the forensic notes, marking every alteration. Murmurs rippled through the room. I lifted my phone from my clutch, pressing the cued command. And speaking of assets, those texts with Vanessa, they've just been sent to everyone here. All at once, phones buzzed, screens lit up, and the room filled with gasps. My sister's hand gripped my shoulder. His father looked away in disgust. His business partner whispered, "Brian, is this true?" Brian shot up halfway, face twisted. "What have you done?" "Exactly what you never thought I could," I said. I paid attention. And right on cue, Andrea entered with her colleague's leather briefcase in hand. Perfect timing, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. The lawyers are here. We're just in time for dessert. Andrea's heels clicked against the hardwood like punctuation marks at the end of a long sentence I'd been writing in secret. She set her briefcase on the table and, with a quiet nod to me, slid a leather portfolio toward my side rather than Brian's. The gesture alone rearranged the room's power. I could feel the slow tilt from his gravity to mine as conversations died into breaths and the chandelier light made glittering halos on the untouched dessert plates. I kept my chin level. 5 years I had practiced being still, while the men in my life mistook stillness for emptiness. Everything we discussed has been filed, Andrea said, her voice calm but edged. And these are for you, Marissa. The way she said my name unapologetically, like I belonged at the center, made something break open in my chest. A small, stunned part of me waited for Brian to laugh and undo the moment with one of his dismissive lines. But he didn't. He lunged. His partner Jeffrey caught his sleeve. "Don't," he hissed, small-voiced for the first time since I'd known him. "Don't make it worse." "Worse," Brian echoed, incredulous, as if the word had never applied to him in any meaningful way. His eyes cut to me bright with rage and the first dawning fear. "You think you know what you're doing?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, and my voice surprised even me, low, steady, a violin string drawn cleanly with the bow. "And I know exactly what you've done." Phones continued to light up along the table, each vibration a percussion beat for the chorus of gasps, and whispered, "Oh my God." My sister had moved closer, one hand on my shoulder, and I felt her there like a lighthouse to aim for. The only unfamiliar face at my side was my own, the woman I had been rehearsing in the mirror for months, the woman who didn't apologize for occupying space. Brian's mother stepped forward, pearls trembling against her throat. "Brian," she whispered, but not to scold. Her eyes sharp, evaluating, flicked to the prenup documents. How could she have gotten this? The room shifted again. How could she not? How could you? It told me everything I had always suspected about her private loyalties. A memory rose up quick and bitter the day she took me to lunch just after we got engaged, folding her napkin while telling me I was lucky to marry into a family that took care of its own. I understood now what she'd left unspoken, as long as I didn't ask what taking care required. Andrea, gentle as a surgeon, opened the next incision. "Mr. Coleman," she said, addressing Brian's attorney, who had arrived breathless and late, "you'll want to advise your client to stop speaking. The packet includes not only documentary evidence, but recordings. One-party consent in this state." Brian's attorney paled. Brian scoffed a brittle sound. "She's lying. She doesn't even know what—" "Shell companies," I said before he could finish. "Straw donors. Phantom invoices. Routing through a consulting subsidiary to scrub the source before it hits your Cayman account. And the post-signature insertions to our prenup." I watched the words hit him like cold rain. For years I had been a soft surface for him to throw his certainty against. Tonight I had a spine. A crackle of radios outside the door drew everyone's eyes. The restaurant manager appeared, cheeks flushed. "Mrs. Coleman, there are agents here. They're asking for Mr. Coleman." His voice faltered on the title. "Mrs. Coleman." For a heartbeat, I tasted the irony, how I had worn that name like a muzzle and was now using it like an instrument. The agents entered in a clean line, measured and calm the way responsibility walks. When they read Brian his rights, the words sounded familiar, like a refrain I'd been humming under my breath for months. Brian pulled back instinctively, then froze as the weight of the room's attention pressed against him. He glanced at his mother. It was not shame on her face. It was calculation. And beneath it, something uglier, recognition. Later, I would understand why. Later, when the dust settled and the legal machinery began its slow grinding turn, I would receive a box of papers from an anonymous sender. Later, when I spread the papers across my kitchen table, I would see a younger version of my mother-in-law's signature, clean and tight beneath a post-dated addendum to her own prenup. Later, I would realize that Brian hadn't invented the trick of rewriting a woman's future after her consent. He had inherited it. The family secret was not pearls and philanthropy, it was forgery dressed as prudence, betrayal taught at a mother's knee. But even before those papers, I felt it, a subterranean tremor of truth moving beneath us. Some legacies aren't heirlooms you display on mantles, they're habits you learn in quiet rooms. As the agents guided Brian toward the door, he twisted back to me, his voice hoarse. Why here? Why now? You could have done this privately. Because I had been erased privately. Because the smallness had always happened behind doors. Because humiliation had been the language he chose for me, and he needed to learn how it sounded in his own mouth. I didn't say all of that, I said you wanted an audience. The room's hush swelled, then broke into fragments, chairs, scraping glasses, clinking murmurs, circulating like drafts under a door. Brian's friends evaporated in pairs, faces gray with self-preservation. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. Jeffrey did briefly red-rimmed undone and pressed his lips together like a man swallowing a confession. When the doors closed behind the agents, the silence felt different. It wasn't shock anymore, it was aftermath. Andrea touched my elbow. Do you need to leave? I need a minute, I said, and I did. I needed to sit in the chair where I had been a prop for 5 years and feel what it was to be a person there. Dessert arrived absurdly. A chocolate soufflé sagging delicately in the center like a mansion with rot in the beams. I stared at it and remembered being 12, my father slurring apologies after breaking a promise, my mother clearing plates while telling me, "We don't make scenes." The first family rule I had never learned how to break. Until now. Claire leaned in. Why didn't you tell me? If I had told anyone, I said I might have asked for comfort instead of justice. The words surprised me with their clarity. It was true. Comfort would have been a warm blanket on a house fire. I needed axes water witnesses. I needed to hear my own voice carried back to me by a room full of people who had once only heard his. Across the table, Brian's mother lifted her necklace, worked the clasp with shaking fingers, and set the pearls in a small, soft pile. These were purchased through the company, she said, not quite to me, not quite to Andrea. They're not personal assets. It was a confession masquerading as compliance, an old playbook resurfacing. My mouth went dry. For a heartbeat, I saw the boy Brian had been learning. I felt pity try to unfurl, and then for once, I let it close again. Compassion is a virtue, but it can also be a leash. I stood. My knees didn't buckle, my hands didn't shake. The dress I had worn like armor fit me differently now. It felt less like protection and more like permission. When I looked around, I saw faces that had once laughed at his jokes and now searched mine for the plot. I thought about identities forged in shadows, the dutiful wife, the quiet teacher, the girl who doesn't make a scene. And under that, the older, hungrier truth, I had always been a witness. Tonight, I became the author. I tucked the portfolio under my arm, slid the manila folder back into the drawer that had once been my hiding place and now was only wood and brass, and nodded to Andrea. I'm ready. When I stepped out of that dining room, the night air felt different against my skin. Crisp, sharp, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. For years, I had been drowning in silence, pretending to breathe while swallowing the weight of his contempt. Now, with every inhale, I felt lighter, though not free. Freedom doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in, testing whether you're strong enough to carry it. Andrea walked beside me, her briefcase in hand, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The agents had taken Brian into the waiting car, and I had watched the doors close on him, the reflection of his face in the window pale and slack with disbelief. I thought I would feel triumphant in that moment, but what I felt was quieter. Not a shout, but a release. Something unspooling inside me that I had wound too tightly for too long. Claire slipped her arm through mine when we reached the street. "You're shaking," she whispered. "I'm not," I said, and realized it was true. My body wasn't trembling. It was steady. It was my sister who shook, tears wetting her lashes, her anger trembling through her bones. For years she had watched me play the role of the agreeable wife, watched him talk over me, diminish me, mock me under his breath. She had wanted to fight for me, and I had never let her. Tonight she shook because I finally had. The house was empty when I returned, my house in my name, a detail Brian had signed away without reading. The irony was bitter on my tongue, but also sweet. For the first time, the silence inside those walls belonged to me. I walked through each room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the cool marble of the kitchen counter, the edge of the desk where I had transcribed his crimes like a dutiful secretary to my own suffering. Every surface felt different, as if the walls themselves had been complicit in his lies and were now exhaling their relief. Sleep came late. My mind kept replaying the faces at the dinner, the gasps when the texts went out, the gray look in his father's eyes the moment his business partner recoiled, as if Brian's sins were contagious. I thought of Vanessa too, my sister's best friend, whose betrayal had cut so deeply it sometimes bled more than his. I wondered what she was doing in that exact moment, whether she had seen the messages light up her phone alongside everyone else's, whether shame burned in her throat like it had in mine for so long, or whether she felt nothing at all. Morning sunlight spilled through the windows like proof that the world kept turning. I brewed coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, the one Brian always mocked because we can afford better. Marissa and sat at the kitchen table with Andrea's documents spread before me. Legal language, financial breakdowns, timelines of evidence. It was overwhelming, but it was also power. For years, Brian's words had been law in our home. Now I had real law on my side, stamped and notarized, undeniable. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of depositions, phone calls with investigators, and whispered conversations with Claire in the quiet of late evenings. Reporters began circling stories leaking into the press. Respected businessman under investigation for fraud. His name in headlines, his picture on the evening news. I should have felt vindicated seeing him exposed, but the truth is more complicated. My stomach twisted each time his face flashed on screen, not because I pitied him, but because I knew that man better than anyone else. I knew the curve of his handwriting, the cadence of his laugh, the softness of his breath when he slept. Loving someone, even someone who destroys you, leaves fingerprints on your soul that can't be erased by headlines. But I didn't let those fingerprints hold me. Instead, I began using them as ink. My students noticed first. "You seem different," one of them said timidly after class when I had been teaching The Great Gatsby with more fire than usual. I had asked them whether Daisy ever loved Gatsby, or only loved what he represented, and in my own words I heard the echo of my marriage. The performance of love, the glittering surface hiding rot beneath. I smiled at the student and said, "What do you think letting her see the question was larger than fiction?" I started hosting small gatherings at the campus cafe, just a handful of young women, at first curious about money, independence, survival. I told them what I wished someone had told me at their age: how to read a contract, how to ask the hard questions, how to pay attention when someone insists you don't need to. Each week, more women came, their notebooks filling with words that might one day save them from men like Brian. For the first time, my years of silence felt less like waste and more like preparation. And then one evening, as autumn wind rattled the cafe windows, I looked up and saw her, Vanessa. She hovered in the doorway, uncertainty written across her face. My chest clenched, memories flooding like knives. But she stepped closer, voice low. "I saw the flyer about your group. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome." The old me would have smiled, politely swallowed the betrayal, smoothed the edges so no one bled. But I wasn't her anymore. I studied her face, the guilt behind her eyes, the hesitation in her stance. And then I said, "This group is for any woman who wants to learn. Everyone deserves independence." She nodded, relief loosening her shoulders. I didn't forgive her. Not then, maybe not ever. But I let her sit with us because what Brian took from me was not going to be passed down to someone else if I could stop it. My revenge wasn't just the downfall of a man, it was the rise of women who would never again be made small in the ways I had been. Weeks turned into months, and the trial loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud. I no longer measured time by his schedule, his moods, his dismissive words. I measured it by chapters drafted for the book I had begun writing, Hidden in Plain Sight, A Woman's Guide to Financial Self-Defense. A publisher had shown interest. For the first time, my voice, the one he had silenced for years, was on paper, permanent, undeniable. I thought back often to that night in the restaurant, The chandeliers, the folded roses, the chocolate souffle collapsing in the center of the table. I thought of Brian's final question to me. Why the public humiliation? Why not do this in private? And I realized my answer was larger than him. Because silence is the soil where betrayal grows. Because secrets rot families from the inside. Because shame thrives in shadows and sometimes the only cure is light. The morning of the trial, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have, fingers grazing the edge of the blazer I'd chosen. It wasn't vanity that kept me there, but recognition. The reflection staring back wasn't the woman Brian had married. She wasn't the soft-voiced wife who lowered her gaze, who let herself be dismissed as fragile, ornamental, small. This woman had lines of resolve etched into her face, a steadiness in her eyes that no one could mistake for ignorance. I almost whispered an apology to that old version of me, the one who thought silence was survival, before I picked up my bag and left. The courthouse loomed gray and unyielding, but inside there was movement. Breath a pulse. Reporters crowded the steps, flashes of cameras puncturing the air like fireworks. They called his name, not mine, and that suited me just fine. He had craved attention all his life. Let him have it now, even if it came laced with shame. When I entered the courtroom, his eyes found me immediately. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd once loved, the confident charm, the sharp intelligence, but it was only a shadow. What stood there was hollowed by arrogance, by the collapse of the empire he'd thought indestructible. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. For once, silence was his burden, not mine. I testified for hours. I laid out the years of evidence, the recordings, the documents. I spoke with the precision of someone who had been underestimated too long and learned to make every word count. The courtroom was silent, except for my voice, and I let it fill the space he once dominated. I spoke not only about fraud and false prenups, but about the weight of being made invisible. About how cruelty doesn't always scream, it drips drop by drop until you drown. By the time I stepped down, my throat was raw, but I felt lighter than I ever had. The verdict came weeks later. Guilty on multiple counts: tax evasion, wire fraud, falsification of documents. He was sentenced to years in prison, his name forever tied to corruption rather than success. And though people congratulated me, whispered words like brave and victorious, the truth was heavier, messier. Revenge doesn't stitch up old wounds, it only stops them from festering further. Some scars will always remain. Yet life began to take a new shape. My book was published, passed from hand to hand in women's circles, classrooms, book clubs. I began receiving letters from strangers, women who saw themselves in my story, who told me they had left relationships that had been eroding them for years. "You gave me courage," one wrote. "You showed me that paying attention could save me." I cried when I read those words, not out of sadness, but because I realized that my pain had been alchemized into something larger than me. Vanessa kept coming to the financial literacy group. She sat quietly at first, ashamed, but gradually began to speak, to ask questions, to share. I didn't offer her friendship, not yet, but I offered her space. And sometimes that is more powerful than forgiveness. One night after class, Claire asked me if I regretted the way I had done it, the public exposure, the dinner, the spectacle. I thought about it carefully. Regret is a word I had lived with for too long, but I shook my head. "He made me small in front of others for years," I said. "It was only fitting that I claimed my voice in front of others too." The truth is, I don't believe in clean endings anymore. There is no perfect justice, no punishment that erases betrayal, no victory that removes the ache of wasted years. What there is instead is choice. To rise, to write your own story, to take the silence forced upon you and break it into 1,000 sharp pieces of truth. Sometimes I still dream of that dinner. The chandeliers, the folder sliding across the table, the way the room seemed to tilt when I finally spoke. But in the dream, I am not afraid. I am steady, whole, certain, because I know now that the greatest revenge is not the downfall of the one who betrayed you, but the rising of the one they tried to break. So if you're listening, if you've ever been silenced, dismissed, betrayed, I want you to remember this. Your quiet is not emptiness. It is observation. It is preparation, it is power, waiting for its moment. And when that moment comes, do not whisper. Speak. Let the world hear you. If my story resonated with you, if you found even a flicker of strength in it, I ask you from the bottom of my heart, please, like this video, share it with someone who needs courage and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that remind us we are never as powerless as we're told. And most of all, leave a comment. Tell me your story. Your voice matters here.